my name is Ray Bowman. I've been involved in international trade for over 30 years. I'm a Certified Global Business Professional, or CGBP. I'm the director of the EDC Small Business Development Center. This is a program sponsored by the Small Business Administration of the U.S. to give consulting and business advising services to small businesses throughout the U.S. I'm a program chair for the Southern California District Export Council. We're appointed by the Secretary of Commerce to promote U.S. exports. I'm also a professor at Cal Lutheran University and Santa Barbara City College, who offer international degree programs and certificates in international trade and logistics. I'm also a member of several trade organizations, such as the American Association of Exporters and Importers, as well as NASBITE, which is dedicated to international trade education for small businesses. So, in this lesson, I'd like to go over international documentation. A lot of errors, a lot of mistakes, a lot of shipments and transactions have had problems because of bad documentation. Most of the time, international importers and exporters don't really see the goods. What they see is the documents associated with those goods. So it's very important to have accurate documentation. I certainly in one video can't go over all documents, but I'm going to try to go over some of the main, more common documents that you'll see in an international trade transaction. Before I do that, though, one of the secrets to getting documentation right is to understanding what some of the common definitions of some of the data fields are that exist in most international documents. These data fields are areas such as the shipper. The shipper is quite often the exporter, but it could be someone designated to export the goods on behalf of the exporter. The consignee is the person receiving the goods. Most often it's the buyer, but it could be someone just designated to receive the goods on the other side. Net weight is the weight of the actual goods that are being shipped, whereas gross weight represents the weight of the entire shipment, including pallets and packaging. International shipments are measured in metrics, so you'll have data fields that may indicate putting the cubic meter or the cube of the shipment. The harmonized code, we'll do other videos that discuss what the harmonized code is in detail, but basically the harmonized code is a 6-digit coding system that describes products. So literally all products, any product that you can think of, will fall under the harmonized code. The harmonized code is organized in 99 chapters, and each of those categories will describe different products in different categories. Some countries will go further than the 6 digits. For example, the U.S. goes to 10 digits, but those first 6 digits are harmonized throughout all the major trading countries. Country of origin, that is the origin of which the goods got their essential character. In other words, it's where the goods were made, not necessarily where they ship from. The carrier is the name carrier that's shipping the goods. In other words, the name of the airline, the steamship line, the rail line, the trucker. The notify party is anyone who should be notified on arrival of the goods. The Incoterm is a 3-letter code that describes the responsibility of an international buyer to an international seller. A lot of documents will ask to specify the currency. This is really important, especially for import documentation, where the goods have to be properly valuated. The forwarding agent, quite often this refers to the freight forwarder who's coordinating the shipment on behalf of buyer or seller. The quantity of the shipment. The unit price of the shipment. The port of embarkation, in other words, which port are these goods leaving from? What the purchase order number is. In other words, the purchase order is the reference number that the buyer gives to the shipment that they're purchasing. The dimensions of the shipment, the length, the width, and the height. This is very important not only in determining the cube of the shipment, but determining the ease of handling or the ability of the goods to be handled on a particular carrier. What the initial mode of transportation is. A lot of times you'll have what we call an intermodal shipment, where you'll have two different modes of transportation. So quite often on documents they'll ask you what the initial mode is if it's a multimodal shipment. The port of discharge, in other words, which is the port of arrival where the goods are actually being discharged. You may have more than one arrival port if the goods are being transshipped. The place of receipt, where the goods are being received, as well as marks and numbers. And these are some very common data fields that you have to get familiar with in knowing their definitions in order to fill out the documents properly. So now we start looking at the different types of shipping documents. The three main documents that you have to be the most familiar with are the bill of lading, the commercial invoice, and the packing list. We often refer to these as a commercial set of documents. The bill of lading is basically the carrier's receipt. So think of it, I often think of it as analogous to an airline ticket. An airline ticket is a kind of bill of lading, a bus ticket. So it's really the carrier's receipt. The commercial invoice represents the bill of sale between the international buyer and seller and specifies who gets title to the goods, the pricing. The commercial invoice is very important because it's one of the critical documents used to clear the goods through customs. So it's very essential for both buyer and seller. The packing list shows how goods are packaged. In other words, are the goods on skids, on pallets? Are they in containers? This is a very important document for purposes of customs inspections, insurance inspections, to run inventory, to make sure, for the buyer to make sure that they've received the goods that were promised. So a packing list is a very essential document. Other important documents are insurance certificates. The most common insurance certificate is marine insurance, which protects the goods against loss or damage. Certificates of origin verify the origin of the goods. They're validated, most certificates of origin, through a chamber. Wood packaging certificate. Most countries, or many countries, will require that any kind of wood packaging demonstrate that they've been either heat treated or fumigated. A lot of different parasites ride within wood packaging or pallets. So most countries are very aware of the need to make sure that those pallets are safe to bring across the borders. Inspection certificates. Inspection certificate is used by a lot of importers and exporters. These are third-party companies that do random sampling inspections on goods. It's a good way for a buyer to ensure that they're getting the things that they're ordering through an inspection. NAFTA certificates are important. Export licenses. These are all very important documents. Custom entry declarations in the U.S. And other countries. We have different types of required entry declarations. In the U.S., we have forms like the Form 641, which is basically a right to make entry. We have another form called an entry summary. An entry summary is basically the record of the completed import transaction, indicating how much duty was paid, description of the goods. They're used for customs records. Certificate of free sale. Basically, a certificate of free sale is often validated by different government agencies, but it's basically a document that signifies that the goods that are being sold abroad can be freely sold within the country that they come from. You have various health certificates. So many countries will require, especially on food items, different drugs, therapeutic items, that there might be a health certificate, medical devices. A letter of credit is a form of payment, but it's basically, the letter of credit itself is a set of instructions that instructs the seller of all the requirements in order to get paid from that bank guarantee. A draft, it looks like a check, but basically a draft is a payment mechanism. It's a payment mechanism where the seller basically sends a draft as a payment obligation to the buyer. The buyer has to accept that obligation in order for that draft to pay. So it's a very common instrument used within banking. There's a request for quote, so quite often companies will have a formalized quote request. There's the pro forma invoice, which is not an invoice itself, but basically a formalized sales quote. It basically shows the buyer, if they were to buy the goods, what that invoice is going to look like. So it's an all-inclusive quote. There's the purchase order, which is a confirmation of what the buyer has purchased from the seller. And these are some of the more common documents that you'll see in international trade. And again, there's many, many more documents, but here are some of the most common ones that you'll see. So the next thing that's important to understand if you're going to get documentation, international documentation right, have good accurate documents, is sort of understanding what the order of these documents are. So really the mother of all documents is the request for quote and the quote. In other words, all of your documents should reflect what was promised or what was quoted. So quite often in the chain of documents or the order of documents, you'll have a request of quote from the buyer. You'll have a response from the seller, which is the sales quote. Then you'll have a formalized quote, which will include not only the cost of the goods, but shipping, trucking, packaging, any other costs that might go along with that final order. Quite often a transaction, a quote or pro forma invoice will be responded to by the buyer with a purchase order referencing a particular quote. Once the goods are shipped, produced and shipped, you'll have a commercial invoice, which is the actual bill of sale, a packing list, all the other required documents that go with the bill of lading shipment, entry documents, and then once goods are cleared through customs, quite often you'll have what's called a delivery order. So it's very important to realize that all these other documents have to relate to the original quote that was given to the international buyer. You want all of your documents to be consistent with that. Inconsistencies quite often result in different document discrepancies, which can lead to delays or even non-payment. So it's very important to organize your trade documents. Again, all of your documents should agree with the terms and conditions of the pro forma invoice and purchase order. All transactions should be filed together and show the flow of the entire document transaction. In other words, it's never a good idea to have your entry documents and your finance documents, your sales documents in different places. Quite often if customs is inspecting, is doing an audit, they're going to look for all the documents that represent a particular transaction. So it's good to have at least copies of all the documents relating to a transaction all together. It's also a good idea to use different types of technology to organize your documents. Particularly with cloud applications, it's a lot easier now to transmit documents, make them uniform, create templates, whether it's something as simple as Excel or something as advanced as using a large platform or ERP system that actually generates your international documents. It's also important to relate your quotes to your international transactions. In other words, develop a numbering system, either within your document software system, or even if it's a system on paper, developing a numbering system that will reference, there'll be a single reference for all of your trade documentation. So that's a very important aspect. It's also good to look at some resources for international documentation. In the U.S., there's a helpline from the U.S. Department of Commerce where they will assist you in understanding the documents that you need for export. and that helpline is 1-800-USA-TRADE. The UN actually has a document toolkit that you can use to help develop your documents. There's a series of different vendors that generate trade documentation. UNSCO is a very well-known one within the United States. There's different software companies like Shipping Solutions, SAP. There's documentation libraries. BNA has a very good one. There's the U.S. Department of Commerce, which has export.gov, which also is a good reference. The Exporters Encyclopedia. There's more resources online than ever to assist exporters, and particularly with international documentation. So I hope this overview helps you in understanding international documents. And remember, consistency is the key to international documentation and good international transactions.